Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And I'm going to actually turn off my video while I talk just to save some bandwidth. I've been having some internet instability today. So anyways, I'm here today to cover two hardwood species, which are often found growing together, but whose bark in particular is easily confused, and that's ash and basswood. So Maya, if you don't mind forwarding the slide. Great. So let's start with ash. So it's in the olive family, the Oleaceae family, for those who like to know the Latin. There are 16 species in North America, 3 of which are found in Vermont. So let's start with one of them. On the left, white ash, which is shown here in this photo. Now, if you could note, that's our colleague, David McMath, who is over 6 feet tall. So I just want you to kind of embed this image in your head of how big and tall these trees can get, because we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So white ash is our most common species in Vermont. It's a component of our northern hardwood forests. So you'll find it growing with sugar maple, our state tree, yellow birch, and American beech, but it's rarely a dominant species in these hardwood forests. It grows best and is commonly found on sort of rich, which means moderate to high levels of calcium and nitrogen, moist, moderately well-drained sites. It's considered a pioneer species. It needs a lot of light to grow compared to our sugar maple, which it grows with, which is much more shade tolerant. It can colonize fertile old fields. You may find it growing along a lot of your roadsides and in large forest openings. And then if you look in the middle, that is green ash. And I should mention Fraxinus, that's the genus. This is Fraxinus pennsylvanica. While it prefers the same site as white ash, it's our most adaptable. It competes well on dry sites, and at the other extreme, competes well on wet sites. Here in Vermont, you'll most commonly see it growing in wetter areas, like in floodplain forests along streams, if anyone's familiar with the floodplain forest in Winooski, and floodplain forests along rivers, and then in wetlands. Because of its adaptability and its tolerance of salt, you're also going to find it commonly planted as a street tree. And then finally, last but not least, black ash. You'll sometimes heard this called as brown ash or basket ash. It's more commonly found on poorly drained seepy soils, peat or muck soils, such as those that you'd find in bogs or wetlands. So unfortunately, many of you may be aware, all species of ash native to North America are listed as critically endangered by the International Union of Concerned Scientists. And that's because of this little bug, the green menace in our bottom left corner, the emerald ash borer. It's a non-native invasive pest. It was introduced from Asia in wood packing material. White ash, which I will talk about later, there is some hope for that, but unfortunately black and green ash tend to be the most susceptible. So Maya, if you don't mind moving on to the next slide. So we've talked about ash. Now let's talk a little bit about basswood. So this is for those again that like to know the Latin, this is in the Malvaceae family or the mallow family. We have one native, which is the American basswood, Tilia americana, and two non-natives, found in Vermont. Most commonly, you'll see little leaf linden and silver linden planted along streets. Our native American basswood, it's not a super common tree, but you're going to find it growing along with ash on those calcium and nitrogen-rich soils, particularly in our rich northern hardwood forests growing with sugar maple and white ash. So if you move to the next one, Maya, please, thank you. So let's get into how we identify trees in winter. We like to think of the 3 Bs. So that's branching pattern, buds, and bark. These are the 3 things that we're going to cue in on to help us identify trees in winter. So let's start with a branching pattern. As you'll see, ash with the arrow pointing there is opposite branched, which means the twigs are coming off the main branch opposite each other. There are 3 main families of trees in Vermont that have opposite branching. The mnemonic is mad horse, M being maples, A being ashes, D dogwoods, and H horse chestnut. Horse chestnuts, you're only going to really see those growing in people's yards. And then dogwoods, that's really an understory tree. So if you're looking at an overstory tree with opposite branching, you can narrow it right down to maples and ashes. And if you'll look, ash branches are a lot stouter than maple. So that can be another sort of clue you can look into. So you'll see below a picture that Peter took of these beautiful winged seeds or samaras, which just like maple winged seeds, but in this case, it's one, not a pair. So you think of the helicopters that probably as kids you stuck on your noses, those were maples. This is just one seed with a wing on it. So ash is primarily wind pollinated, and the seeds are mostly dispersed by the wind. So again, have that little added benefit to the wing on the seed. To the right, you'll see basswood. This is alternatively branched. So the twigs are coming off, not across from each other, but alternate. The nutlets, so this too is wind dispersed. And so you'll see there's a little, we call this a modified leaf, and that helps the seeds fly, just very similar to ash. Okay, next slide, Maya, please. All right, so the second characteristic that can help us in winter identify trees is the buds. So ash buds to me, it might be the fact that it's lunchtime, but I think they look like Hershey's Kisses. White ash, so we'll look that the bud on the end we call the terminal bud, and the bud below that leads to side branches, that's called the lateral bud. And then the part of that U-shaped on the white ash on the left, that's what we call the leaf scar. That's where during the growing season, the leaf would have been attached to the branch. And so these are all things that we're going to want to look at when we're looking at buds. So in the case of the white ash, it has a U-shaped leaf scar. So you'll see that lateral bud kind of tucks down a little bit, and the leaf scar actually kind of surrounds it, forming this like U-shaped. Now, if we look at green ash right next to it, you'll see that lateral bud does not dip down into the leaf scar. The leaf scar doesn't wrap around it. Instead, it's kind of more sits on top of it. So that leaf scar is more D-shaped. When we get to black ash, the key difference there, one, that's really like the bud itself is this rich chocolate. So that's the real, Hershey's Kiss right there. But if you look, you'll see, if you look on the white ash, the terminal bud sits right above the lateral bud. But on black ash, there's actually a space between the terminal and the lateral. And so that's another way that you can tell. Basswood bud, far right, very different. I learned it as a monk with its hood up. I've heard others think of it as a chipmunk wearing a sweatshirt hood. And finally, which has become my favorite, a mouse with a motorcycle helmet. So I'll share all of those in the hopes that like one of those will help you remember that bud. Okay, next one, Maya. And finally, sometimes you won't be able to see the buds. So really all you have, and sometimes branching pattern can be tough. So bark is another really key thing that can help you identify what tree you're looking at. So on the far left, we're looking at sort of the young bark of ash, and it's really an ashy gray, and it has these shallow furrows. And when I say furrows, those are sort of the little valleys. The ridges, which are the raised area of the bark, they're more broken into these small squarish or rectangular blocks that it may or may not to start to form a diamond pattern, which we'll see more clearly when we look at the mature bark. And then basswood, the bark when it's young is light gray to light brown and very smooth. It will also sprout vigorously from the stump, more commonly. So you'll see on the far right, there's a picture of a basswood with all those sort of sprouts coming up. So I feel like, tree ID it's a puzzle of trying to find all these different characteristics that can lead you to identifying. So, we'll talk about some of those other little tricks that you could use to verify what you're seeing. Sprouting, in basswood can be one of them. So next one, please, Maya. So when the white and green ash trees mature, these blocks, they eventually intersect and they form these diamond-shaped furrows, again, those valleys, and these raised ridges. For anyone living, in the Champlain Valley, you might see another tree that has diamond-shaped bark, and that's hickories. particularly bitternut hickory has this diamond pattern to its bark, except it's not raised. White ash has these ridges that are pretty raised, whereas the ridges in hickories are a lot smoother, a lot flatter. And then if you look at black ash, this has a very different bark than green and white ash. It's darker gray to grayish brown. It has these porky scales that thicken and they become a little bit more knobby as the tree grows. And then basswood, as that tree matures, those furrows, they form these long flattened ridges, so it's not as raised as ash. And the ridges kind of loosely intersect, so they're not going to form a diamond pattern like ash. But again, because they grow together, it's, you know, sometimes at quick glance, you can think you're looking at an ash tree. But again, you're going to look at the branching. If you have buds, you're going to look at the buds and try and narrow it down. Okay, next. So basswood has many wonderful characteristics and uses. Its nectar and alluring scent make it a favorite of beekeepers. It's a lightweight, soft wood, which, you know, I've carved spoons with, you know, lots of carvers use it for all sorts of implements. We've used it as sort of trim in our house, so it can be used for, you know, finished carpentry work. And apparently it's a good tone wood, and it's used in musical instruments. I also, you know, want to mention that its fibrous bark, it's also used by the Abenaki in basket making. And then that picture in the middle, you'll see is a yellow-bellied sapsucker. And they are especially found with basswood. Those little holes that horizontal line is characteristic sapsucker feeding. They're drinking the sap that oozes out of that. So again, it's those little tricks. If you see a hardwood tree that has sapwood damage, it most very likely is a basswood because they tend to prefer those. So kind of put all the other pieces together and look at the bark and look at the branching and see if you can narrow it down. And last but not least, the leaves of basswood, they're high in nitrogen, calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And they do contribute most of these nutrients to the forest floor in the fall when the leaves fall. And for those, you'll see it has a heart-shaped leaf. So for those who follow the doctrine of signatures, a basswood leaf is heart-shaped and is thought to be able to, quote, gladden the heart, uplifting the mood, as well as gently lowering blood pressure and expanding blood vessels. So next. Now we'll look at ash. Ash has many important uses. It's a really strong wood, so many of your tool handles are likely made out of ash. Baseball bats are made out of maple and ash. It can be used as structural wood. We use it we have used ash as braces in our timber frame house. It's also good firewood. As the Lady Celia Congreve's firewood poem goes, ash new or ash old is fit for a queen with a crown of gold. So the ash tree, I was interested to learn, it's a central sacred tree in Norse mythology as well, standing in the middle of the world with branches that stretch out over all the 9 realms. And here in Vermont, the ash tree on the right, as you see, black ash in particular, is a very important tree to the Abenaki, who believe that humans emerged from ash trees, and it's thus the origin of human life. The splints or strips of wood from black ash trees are the main traditional material for Abenaki basketry, and shown here in a couple pictures of photos of that. So next, Maya. So ash provides really a number of important ecological functions. The seeds are eaten by all sorts of wildlife: squirrels, mice, finches, grouse, turkeys. There are research in 2010 identified that there are 43 species of insects or spiders that are known to be associated only with ash trees, for either feeding or breeding purposes. And there's another 30 of those that are associated with 1 to 2 other host plants other than ash. So again, ash is pretty important in their life cycle. Further, green and black ash leaves, they're an important food source for tadpoles and caddisflies. So think of those trees growing along floodplains and wetlands. White ash is fairly fast growing. And so remember David and the big ash tree we saw at the beginning. So they can get to relatively large diameters. And then within, 100 100 or so years, those, those large diameters can form these hollow cavities. And those cavities are used by all sorts of wildlife for denning: porcupines, bats, owls, woodpeckers. A lot of those cavity nesting species can use that. Ash will leaf out later in the spring. And then, as you see in this photo, this ash tree in the middle, while some of its neighbors are still green, is already sort of expressing its full fall foliage. So they'll lose their leaves earlier in the fall than most other tree species. And this can be important on a sort of microsite level for some of the spring ephemeral wildflowers like hepatica, trillium, some of those, just ones that we're just so happy to see, that need to flower before the canopy closes in. So having ash around, and leafing out later, it gives them a little bit longer period to be able to complete that part of their life cycle. And then all species of ash have leaf litter that also, like basswood, is high in nitrogen and phosphorus in particular. In the fall, the trees shed those leaves, and that nutrients are cycled back into the soil. This is important when you think of, I mentioned the caddisflies and the tadpoles. This is particularly important in aquatic ecosystems, where the productivity of those organisms is much higher as a result of that leaf litter input, that nutrient input. And then finally, black ash in particular in those wetlands is really able to regulate the water table, which can prevent flooding. So really cool and important species ecologically. All right, so next. So one thing we want to talk about in these lunchtime webinars is sort of the outlook for these species that we're talking about today. So this is a quick review for those who have attended our previous webinars this winter. But according to the Vermont Climate Assessment, Vermont is indeed warming, especially our winters. We've lived that the last couple winters, as you'll remember. Average temperatures have increased by nearly 2 degrees since 1900, and winter temperatures in particular oh, sorry about that. We've got a funny little thing in the middle. So you can ignore the thank you slide in the middle of this slide. I'm not sure how that got there, but anyways. And then, next thing about our climate, Vermont is getting wetter. So precipitation has increased 21% since 1900. And, with flooding, expected to increase. And so, with these sort of changes in climate, it's important, I just want to note too, something for you to think about is that these changes also amplify some of the threats that our forests are currently facing. So think about invasive species, insect pests like emerald ash borer, forest diseases, and deer browse. So it kind of cumulatively can put more stress on our forests. So, as the climate change continues to shift these growing conditions, generally speaking, we can expect growing conditions to become more favorable for southern adapted species. So think oaks and hickories, and less favorable for our currently adapted tree species. So think sugar maples and balsam fir. But that doesn't mean that sugar maple is going to disappear from our forests. What it does mean, is really that these changes are going to put more stress on those trees, on those sugar maples. And as I mentioned, sort of with the amplified stress of sugar maple is a preferred browse species for deer. So if we have sort of increase of deer browse and invasive insects and invasive earthworms, it's just going to make it harder to regenerate species like sugar maple and get that next generation established. So Maya, if you could do the next one. So our ability to predict what species will be successful in the future, it really depends on a couple of things. So as you see here, this is the current distribution for basswood. It's going to depend on the current distribution of that species. It's going to depend on the suitability of the habitat in the future, given the changes we just talked about. And it's going to depend on a species' ability to migrate to that suitable habitat in the future. So can the seeds be carried by the wind? Can it not only regenerate from seed, but also vegetatively? So how when we think about it, how does basswood hold up in this future climate? So according to one of these models, this is the Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas. Basswood, as shown in the photo, it's widely distributed in the eastern United States. And of those three factors, the model predicts a small increase in habitat throughout its range, given its ability to sprout vigorously, which we call vegetative reproduction, and its ability to grow quickly. It has a good capability to adapt to a changing climate. And given it's wind dispersed, based on its historic migration, time it takes to reach sexual maturity, a lot of these other factors that the model will account for, it is possible that some of the new habitat will be colonized within 100 years. So the future looks promising for basswood. If we go on to ash, the next slide, there we go. So in the absence of emerald ash borer, so holding everything else equal, the model suggests that ash might see a small increase of white ash in the future. But as I mentioned earlier, emerald ash borer really threatens the survival of all species of ash in Vermont, black ash being the most vulnerable. So our focus here is really to think about what changes we can expect with the loss of ash due to the emerald ash borer. So as I mentioned earlier, black ash, it's a spiritual resource used in basket making and other traditional life ways for the Abenaki, and not just for the Abenaki, but for all the indigenous peoples within that historic range of black ash. So from the Lake States all the way to the coast of Maine. I mentioned earlier that there are 43 species of insects and spiders that are known to be associated only with ash trees, and they really face a high risk of extinction. In 2016, some scientists published an article that listed 100 invertebrate species that specialize in feeding on North American ash trees. And of those, 34 are moths, including this one here, the Canadian sphinx moth. And this moth is considered at very high risk of extinction because it feeds exclusively on black ash. As you all know from, ecology, probably 101, insects being the base of the food chain, it's just not just the loss of the tree species, but really all those that depend on it. And it can have, cascading effects, many of which we aren't even aware of or can't even predict at this point. So when we talk about some of the wetland communities where ash is growing in the overstory, oftentimes in the understory, you'll see invasive plants like honeysuckle and buckthorn. So if those plants are controlled, they can actually prevent the replacement of some of these ash trees as they fall out of the overstory. So another thing to think about in terms of, stewardship. And then I mentioned the, productivity of and higher levels of caddisflies and tadpoles. That loss of that rich leaf litter can really impact our aquatic food systems as well. And then in black ash swamps, when you think of the overstory of ash trees, because those trees have such an important role in regulating the water table and, preventing flooding, there's a potential that those communities will transition from a forested wetland to more of a shrub and sedge dominated wetland. So Maya, do you mind doing the last slide here? But that's all like super depressing. So I don't want to end on that depressing note. And I want you to kind of keep hope alive. And I think a lot of the hope that I have is in some of the research now coming out of Michigan, and that's where the emerald ash borer was first discovered in 2001. So these researchers went back to some of the forests in several different counties where emerald ash borer had gone through those forests and had attacked trees. And they found in some cases up to 75% survival of white ash. Unfortunately, black ash and green ash don't have as hopeful an outlook, but I think it's important. We can invest in the future of ash here in North America. So it's not a lost cause. I think just leave you with the thoughts that if you're a forest landowner, you don't need to cut all of your ash trees. And as shown by the research in Michigan, some of them may have some level of resistance. And so one of my favorite phrases I've heard UVM forestry professor Dr. Tony D'Amato say is, no tree is immune to the chainsaw. So you need to leave some trees in the hopes that some will survive and pass those traits on to the next generation. And another, key point to make is I think early on, some folks, there was thought that maybe By thinning or removing large individuals, you could reduce the impact of emerald ash borer. And unfortunately, that hasn't been shown to be true. So just know that that's not gonna, by doing that, that's not really gonna do much to limit sort of the impact of that pest. So it's really important thus to really manage the forest ecosystem, not the pest. So we have another webinar that we can include the link to in the follow-up email that talks a little bit more specifically about this. Peter covers this and that. But, you know, things to think about are, you know, if you're conducting a harvest, leave your healthy, vigorous ash in all sizes. Promote the regeneration of ash, that next generation, by creating some of these larger openings. So less, definitely more than a quarter or a third of an acre. You know, you think about increasing the diversity of species in your forest, the structural diversity, and this means sort of structural diversity, meaning the different vegetative layers. So you have 0 to 5 feet off the ground. That's what we call the understory. The midstory would be about 6 to 20, and then you have your overstory. So when you think about forests with greater diversity, and this is species, genetic, structural, that they may also have less risk to climate change. So again, we'll send you the link to that webinar if you're interested in learning more about that. And finally, I'll just end with, you can use insecticides. There is a synthetic one, and there's also there's an organic one, and there's also a non-organic one that you can preserve individual trees in your yards or trees in your forest for really cultural or join us in preserving genetic diversity. The Land Trust, we're partnering with others to treat groves of 15 to 20 trees within a forested setting. Ash or dioecious, di meaning two, they have male and female trees. So if you're treating trees for genetic diversity, you definitely want to favor females with the goal of really conserving the genetics. So this can complement forest management if you are doing forest management in your woods. We have properties owned by VLT where we're managing for ash, but we're also treating groups of, 20 ash trees to ensure the genetic viability of the species in the future. So with that, I think we'll open it up to questions. And, oh, actually, no, Maya's got an announcement. Okay, there you go, Maya. I remembered this time.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. Just to mention quickly that when you leave the webinar, you should have a survey that's popped up on your computer, just asking for any feedback you're willing to share with us about our webinars. So we'd love to hear any thoughts you have. And then we have some upcoming events here, a few more tree ID related events. We have our final Tree Talk Tuesday on March 21st, 2 in-person tree ID events in Barrie and Burlington, as well as a couple events that you can see here. So you can visit vlt.org to learn more about the Vermont Land Trust, sign up for these events. And thank you again for being here. And Peter is going to go ahead and start reading out some of your questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Caitlin. That was great. So Christina has a question. She says, with 75% survival rate of white ash, is there a pursuit of crossbreeding those survivors with more vulnerable green or black ash? Wondering if hybridization like this actually is possible and whether it happens naturally.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not aware of research doing that. I know they're trying to breed some of the resistant genes of Manchurian ash with our North American ash. I'm not aware of really our ash species hybridizing. Peter, are you aware of any of them hybridizing?
I'm not, no.
Really? So I mean, it's definitely a really great point and thought. I think they're so early. That paper came out just, I think, a year, maybe 2 ago. So it's sort of early on, and they are trying, I'm sure, hustling to really identify what is leading to that survival. Is it, a resistance? Is it, so yeah, just I think a lot of questions about that.
We also had a question from somebody wondering, you mentioned that some ashes, I think green ash, are planted along streets. So what would be a good replacement for those street trees?
Yeah, I know there are several sort of towns, Burlington, Williston, they're doing a lot of sort of planting to try and diversify. And so, for street trees, I mentioned, lindens are great. Red maples are planted wildly. I mean, I think the key here is what we're learning is diversity. So not just replacing it with one single species. I will, maybe I'll have Maya put this in the follow-up email, but the Urban and Community Forestry Program has a really great tool that you can learn about all the different sites that many street trees, what their adaptations are. So if you have a place that's, going to get a lot of salt, you can find what are the trees that are really salt tolerant. So I can share that with you, and you'll get a whole really great list of species to think of.
The next question was from Patrick, wondering how much it costs to treat an ash tree and whether there are applicators who you would recommend.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So I don't know how much it costs to treat using the organic one, but generally for the emamectin benzoate, which is the chemical that's most successful at protecting ash, it's usually, I think when I last checked with some contractors, it's like $10 to $12 per diameter inch. And you can treat every 3 years. As long as you're treating those trees before they've really become attacked by the emerald ash borer. If it's early on and you still have a pretty healthy crown, but once it starts to show pretty significant, I've heard 25 to 30% crown dieback, is really not, that tree doesn't have a ton of hope. So, really identifying your trees now when they're prior to attack and getting some quotes is sort of a good approach. But I've heard generally 10 to 12. And then in terms of we can put this in the follow-up email too, but the Urban and Community Forestry Program, they do maintain a list of contractors who are treating trees with emamectin benzoate. So they would need to have a commercial pesticide license, but there's a number of companies now that are doing that. Yeah, and some are starting to do, a couple of forestry consultants are starting to do treatments in forested settings, which is a different license. But yeah, you can talk to the contractors about it. They'll help you navigate that part of it.
So Steve wonders, what's the best way to identify female ash trees at various times of year?
Yeah, so I mean, the best time is, I would say probably June, when you see those seeds really starting to show on the trees. And typically, they'll hold their seed, into the fall. Sometimes you might even, see it in the winter, but definitely in the fall. What's tricky is I thought I was going crazy because I spent a couple of years looking on this one property for females and I just wasn't seeing any seeds. And then last year we had a big seed year. So they're kind of cyclical and they'll have these kind of mast years where they have a higher production of seeds, and that occurs every 2 to 3 years. And we had one last year and I was like, oh, okay, that was the problem. I wasn't seeing them. It wasn't as easy to see them. So sometimes, particularly in forested settings where you're not getting as much light, or for whatever reason, you're just not it's going to be a little bit harder, but you'll definitely want binoculars. So really from June into the fall. Peter, any other tips on that? I know you've done a lot of that too.
I think my only tip is, because it's so hard to see, bring binoculars when you do it. That really helps you see up into the canopy and figure out whether there's seeds up there or not. There was a follow-up to that. How abundant are female ash relative to male ash?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that, Peter. Do you?
I don't. It varies. When we were surveying on the King farm, there were tons of females and not very many males. And then down on the property in Brattleboro, there seemed to be equally as many males as females. So I didn't really, I don't know. I guess I haven't seen a pattern.
Yeah.
And another question just popped up. How can you identify male ash?
Yeah, so that would just be the male flowers. that is really hard. I have tried to identify, and this was when I could see some flowers. I've tried to identify the male flowers. They are different than the female flowers. But Peter, have you successfully differentiated those with binoculars?
It's really hard. It's really hard when you're trying to differentiate between the two using flowers in the spring. So I just wait until the summer, and then you know, the ones with seeds are the females and the ones without are males.
Yeah.
So early on, I don't even try because that's
When I was getting desperate, I tried and I didn't succeed, but
yeah. Couple other questions came up. We're a little past time, but if people want to hang out, and if you have the time, Caitlin, maybe we can go over these. These are ones that I think you sort of covered. Christina had a question about what are the current recommended best practices for slowing EA or stopping EAB. Not sure we're going to stop it. But.
Yeah. I mean, I know, so in some cases, you can girdle trees. So initially it's sort of evolved how we look at it. Initially, they thought they could slow it by clearing all host species, all ash within like a couple mile radius from where they found EAB. Unfortunately, EAB is well beyond that radius by the time you find it because it's so hard to kind of see. So that didn't really work for sort of slowing down the spread. So I know, they use these trap trees, which you girdle a tree, which can be a really great early detection tool. It can also help to, if you girdle, groups of trees, it can help to sort of concentrate sort of the EAB in those trees. EAB will attack healthy trees, but it's going to be drawn to sick trees more because the volatiles that those sick trees release. So I've heard that, in some cases you can sort of girdle a group and it concentrates and then you cut down those trees in the fall. But, I mean, I think the thing is this pest moves so quickly and it can be really impacting your woods before you even know it. So really slowing it down isn't, it's not really a super viable option. I think really it's thinking about sort of your overall management goals for your property and thinking about how you can, again, sort of encourage diversity of species, structural diversity, to really think about kind of keeping that ecosystem together. I guess those are just kind of a couple thoughts I have on that further. Peter, any more there, like in terms of,
Yeah, I think just if you're really concerned, paying attention to where emerald ash borer is found in the state and trying to keep your wood as local as you can, understanding the life cycle of the EAB and when it's active, when it's out and about, when it's safe to move logs or firewood, and when it's not. Again, keeping the wood as local as possible will help slow the spread. And make sure that if you're going off to a camp somewhere and away from home, if your EAB is around your place, don't bring firewood with you. Just those kinds of common sense things. And the last question was, can you sort of cover the susceptibility of the 3 different ash species? One person said that they had mostly white ash on their property, which are now all dead, and wonders how the green and black ash are going to do relative to white ash.
Yeah, so I mean, it sounds like the black ash is really the most susceptible. They haven't found a lot of sort of resistance to EAB with that one, and similarly with green ash. But it does sound like white ash does have some level of resistance, and that's really based on that research out of Michigan. Yeah. There are, I will, important to mention too, that there are other diseases and there's sort of general ash decline that can also occur in ash yellows. So if you're seeing dying ash trees, it may be EAB, it may be ash yellows, it may be a combination of sort of everything. Ash is also super sort of intolerant of drought. So if ash is growing on a really dry site, that can really affect its health. So yeah, sort of a lot of things to think about with ash health.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. That covers it.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And I hope you'll get out in the woods with us on a couple tree ID hikes if they work for being in your area. And in a couple weeks, Dan will be covering spruce, fir, and pines. So hopefully you'll join us for that.
Great. Thanks so much, Caitlin and Peter, and have a great day, everyone.